Welcome back to the show. My name is Cody Lawrence, and this is Spare No Arrows. I have a very special episode today where I am having a conversation, not confrontation,
Maybe.
with with Nicole, who is a professing premillennial dispensationalist. And so we're going to talk about dispensationalism because a group that I'm a part of online is doing kind of a push to do some critiques of dispensationalism. And Nicole was one of the fortunately nice people who offered me some pushback, and we were kind of talking about before we went live how she has gotten some really nasty pushback from anti-dispensationalists in the past, which is a shame. Like, we should be able to have reasonable, level-headed conversations with each other without, throwing around the term heretic or whatever. And so you were one of the people who, offered reasonable pushback. And I thought, hey, I've asked multiple dispensationalists on the show in the past, and they've either just insulted me or had no interest in talking. And I thought we could have a really good conversation about this. Nicole is at Cursed with Common Sense on Instagram, and she is also the author of a book of the same name about Christianity. So welcome to the show, Nicole.
Hi, thank you. First of all, I almost faked sick to get out of this because, sometimes you feel like you want to be in a conversation like this. And then sometimes I'm like, I'm not qualified for this conversation. I was doing some research to try to figure out maybe what you were going to say and then, what I could anticipate what to say back. And it was so scholarly of conversations that I wanted to back out. And then I thought, no, my whole point of anything I'm trying to do is we should talk about these things and not feel like you have to be a super genius in absolutely every aspect of everything just to talk about something. So I'm kind of doing this to prove that I am just a person who's trying to figure some stuff out, am willing to talk about it and be recorded talking about it.
Yeah, that's great.
Why can't we do this? Right. Okay.
Right. I totally agree with you. I think one thing that I try to do with my podcast is to make theology accessible. And that seems like that's what both of us want to do, which is great. So we're normal people. We can have a level-headed, reasonable conversation just about what's the information that's accessible to people without reading, tons of academic journals or things that you can only get a subscription through if you go to a seminary or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
You said the first thing that you kind of wanted to talk about was why we came to what we currently believe and maybe our experiences in dispensationalism. So you can go ahead and go first.
Okay, because I kind of do want to walk through this because this is fairly new to me. That doesn't mean I haven't dug so deep into it. I just need to figure out what I believe, right? So it's not
that you are constantly reading theology books and especially things about the end time and dispensational stuff. So you clearly are really into reading and studying this kind of thing, and I appreciate that.
Right. Thanks. Okay, so kind of like this book that I wrote, it's been 6 years now. I knew when I was writing it, this was super entry level stuff, and I wanted to write it at that time because I felt like this perspective I want to write right now before I get too deep and am unable to write like that. So I spent a lot of time, this was in my early 30s. I didn't even know if I believed in God. Do I believe in Jesus? If I do believe in God, which God do I believe in? So I spent a lot of time kind of in that area. So once I figured that out, I don't know if you know the Bible Project.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so actually, the seminary that I went to, Tim Mackey was one of the professors at that seminary who did the Bible Project. So yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, so I was into the Bible Project. I did my first Bible in 1 year was through the Bible Project. And I almost listened probably for 6 years straight. I feel like I got everything in at that time, and that's what I needed at that time. In my book, you'll understand why I regret writing this part now. I even said so many areas of the Bible are not meant to be taken literally, which kind of kills me right now, but that's just I just thought that, and I didn't even know there were options or whatever. So I probably took it too far because I was trying to figure out what was even going on. So I was even to the point where I thought, like, and I don't know what you think about this, but like Jonah and the whale, I thought that was not literal. I think that's taking it too far. Do you like? Or
Yeah, I
okay,
think there literally was a sea
okay,
monster of some kind, and Jonah literally was swallowed by the monster for 3 days, and he
okay, good.
really did get spit out. Yeah, so
Okay,
I take
so
a literal interpretation of that. Yeah.
okay, and so do I, especially now. But at that time, I don't even talk about my book anymore because of that one sentence that I wrote. It,
Interesting.
I don't like it. But so that's how far I was into not literal, but I didn't even really know that. Okay, so in addition to that, I knew like Jesus was coming back just because I heard people say Jesus is coming back, but it was just like I didn't even really think about it because it seemed like it like in 10,000 years or a million years, and and I don't even know what that means or looks like, but why do I care? Because it's like in a million years. You're
Yeah,
just really abstract, right?
sure.
So I never thought about it because I was going to a seeker friendly church, so obviously the stuff that I was absorbing, nobody's talking about it in any sort of fashion except for saying, "Oh, Jesus is coming back," and you're just like, "Oh yeah,
Yeah.
okay, okay, right." So that's like where I started. So then 2020 hits, and that's when like I think I must have started following you, and I feel like we bonded in like what's happening. Like this
Yeah.
is insane. Okay, so then I'm like, what's going on? And then you're now I don't trust anyone or anything, so I'm just researching anything about like, medical stuff. I'm just realizing that where's the source of anything, like any of this? Where's everyone getting this information from? So then I kind of start going in that mentality. This will wrap up soon here. Hang on. So then I even was like, people are like, oh, it's the end times. And I'm like, what? So then I'm like, well, what does that even mean? What's the end times? And then I started, it was like, Trump is being used by God to save the world in the end times. And I'm like, well, okay, I don't know. Is he? Where's this in the Bible? Where's like this part where it like gets really bad and then all of a sudden it gets really good because Trump's saving everyone? So I was like, this doesn't make sense. And like, I kind of want it to make sense. Obviously, things are really bad. And can somebody like come save us? Okay, so like now I'm thinking we're saving ourselves because if we're in the end times, this doesn't add up though. Either we are in the end times and it goes down, or this isn't the end times and like Trump is gonna save us. And I'm saying Trump is kind of a joke, like we're gonna save ourselves or this hero is gonna save us. So then I'm like, where does this fit in with the Bible? Because now I'm thinking we're in the end times, which I still do, but okay. So then I start like reading all these different versions of like what does end times mean, and nothing was adding up at all. And I'm reading Revelation, and in my mind it is future. Like I don't even know where I came up with that, but I've just always thought that, right? Which you
It's
were probably
it
like,
seems
oh,
when you read it at face value, you're like, "Oh, I don't think the sun and the stars have fallen out of the sky yet, so it
yeah,
must
how
be in
could
the
it
future."
have? And I'm still here, so that's gotta.
Yeah.
And then I was like, what's happening? Okay, so then I went on this thing where I was like, oh, Bible prophecy, what's that? That must be like the ticket. Like this is going to tell us what's going on. But then I thought prophets. I didn't even really know what prophecy was. So then I talked to this girl who's showing me all these like modern day prophets,
Mhm.
which I don't know how you feel. Like I just feel uncomfortable with that. So then
Yeah,
I'm
I
following
think
these.
modern day prophets are 100% all false.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so then I'm like, this feels so wrong, and I'm even embarrassed to tell people I'm watching these people, and I was just like, this is really uncomfortable. I don't think I'm into prophecy.
Yep.
Right, like, because that's all I knew about prophecy is like these weird people and there's like weird music, and I'm just like, this is uncomfortable. So
Mhm.
then I hear about these red heifers. Okay, do you know a little bit of even about this?
I
I won't
know
get into it too far.
about what the Bible says, but give me like a, single paragraph summation, because I'm really curious. I've heard this a few times, but I don't really know what the big deal is.
So
So
I
tell
didn't
me.
either. I'm like, why is everyone so into these red heifers? Like, what's that? So if you live in Israel and you want to build a third temple, like that's your mental, that's like what you want to do so bad. you have to sprinkle the ashes of these red heifers because that's what like the old law said. And I think that's like part of this like initiation ritual before you can start building it. So for the first time in 2000 years, they have these perfect red heifers that would qualify to, in their mind, to be these ashes that they can sprinkle in order to start building this temple. So I'm like, why are they building this temple? And so then I totally backtrack and I ended up, right, like, oh, Israel wants to build this temple because they think the Messiah is coming. And then I just went
And then
back.
it all snowballed from there.
Yeah. And then once I learned, like, I don't know, somehow like it all came together. And then I started reading the Bible like through that lens. And to me, it's like, oh, okay. And so then, so that's why like all these terms when you're like, oh, dispensationalism, I'm like, I don't even know what that means. I started with these red heifers and backtracked, and now I'm rereading it, and I'm like, this all makes sense in this with these lenses on, I guess you would say. So
Yeah.
that's kind of where I ended up here.
Interesting. Yeah. So
Yes.
I'm coming, well, actually, both of us come from a really similar perspective, but I have ended up in a very different place than you in terms of like biblical prophecy, obviously. And I think hopefully I can offer you an interesting, different perspective to look at, just because we talked a little bit about this off air, and you were like, I've never even heard about that. Like, that seems, your view sounds outrageous to me. And so I'm
Yep.
talk a teensy weensy bit about that.
Okay.
But my personal story is that I grew up in deep South, heavily dispensational, premillennial. Um, that kind of prophecy being taught, like, we're in the end times. Jesus could come back any day now because it's so bad. And so I lived a good chunk of my life in that. And it, like it does with most people, it was a terrifying experience, and it's scary even for us nowadays if we're living in this world. Obviously we can look forward to the hope of Christ's return, so that's not what I'm saying, but
I get it.
to imagine that uh we're heading towards an impending collapse, and that's not to say I don't believe that there's a possible impending collapse of America or whatever, but to think that like future is ultimately going to go bad. It's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. That was scary for me. As a kid, and like, I would think, oh man, I at least want to go to college first, or I'd like to get married one day, but Jesus could come back any day. And, that just like caused
for sure
some problems as a kid, but also throughout my whole life, I think I really respected scripture and I wanted to be faithful to scripture. And that's just all the teachers that I was surrounded with, people who believe that. And so that's the kind of theology that I picked up. And I thought, well, even though it's scary, I know I can trust in God, and, at least I get to go to heaven, and it's all going to be okay in the end and in the resurrection. But then later, I started kind of hearing different perspectives. And I think later in life, over the past, maybe 10 years or so, I probably became more amillennial, because I think most churches, maybe not in the South, are more amillennial. And then just recently, after like 2020 or so, I have embraced postmillennialism for a lot of the same reasons that you have. I started looking very deeply into things like, prophecy and the direction the world was going. And I just landed in a different place, away from that kind of thing that I grew up with. So kind of the first thing I wanted to do is define dispensationalism and premillennialism for people who are listening, in case they don't know what that is. Whenever I criticize dispensationalism, a lot of people, and I think you had this impression too, was that, what, you don't believe in dispensations, right?
Yeah.
And that's not what dispensationalism is. According to Ryrie, and do you like respect the writings of Ryrie, or where are you with him?
So you're the first one I heard you talking about him, and so I don't know.
Yeah, and that's okay. So we get like the theology, especially the theology of dispensationalism, has been kind of put together by a lot of popular guys. Ryrie is one of the most popular guys from the past century or so. And so I think he gives a pretty well accepted definition. And you can tell me if you agree or disagree with any parts of this definition too, but I just want to lay out a definition. And so he says, and I shared this definition with you before, he says, that the essence of dispensationalism is one, the recognition of a consistent distinction between Israel and the church, a consistent and regular use of a literal principle of interpretation, and three, a basic and primary conception of the purpose of God as his own glory rather than the salvation of mankind. Do you agree with that? Disagree?
Yeah, that's what I understand it being. Yes.
Cool. And then how do you uh, there are a couple of different kinds of premillennialism too. There's something called historical or historic premillennialism, which is the premillennialism that was more common through church history. And then there's dispensational premillennialism, and you'll probably disagree with this, and we can talk about this, but it's my view that premillennial dispensationalism started kind of in the 1800s and was not the traditional historical version of the church, but uh, define your kind of premillennialism.
Well, I guess correct me if I'm wrong, because this is all these terms are fairly new to me, but I know what I think. Okay. So I think it has to do with where you put this 1,000 years and if you think it's literal or not.
Yeah, the millennial.
Right, and then where you place it in the timeline of events, and then where you place us in the timeline of events. So I think premillennialism, which is what I think, is there's still a literal future 1,000-year reign of Jesus on earth to come, and I think that's fairly soon.
Okay.
And I don't know that you would have to think it's fairly soon. That's why I'm interested in it, but that's...
Yeah, just as a tangent, what do you mean by soon? Because people have been saying soon in the Bible. So what is soon?
Well, so we'll probably get into maybe a little off track, and we don't have to stay there. But so I'm reading about in Revelation that I think is future from like chapter 4 on is what's going to happen during what I believe is a 7-year tribulation. Okay. So I'm reading about these things, and it seems like the world is lining up where those things are super realistic, and it looks like the structure is there to implement this stuff fast. Yeah. One of the things I mentioned to you is just like, for some reason, it's really clear, is the mark of the beast, right? Like that's pretty obvious. And it seems like if there's a mark on your hand or your forehead that you have to use to pay, you're like, well, that couldn't have really happened that long ago unless it's more like not literal. And you could be like, oh, it meant anything. But if it really, what I think it really means, like in your hand or your forehead, and now you see Amazon hand pay, and you see Elon Musk putting in a brain chip in your head, you're like, oh, that's how you could buy or sell. And then you're seeing, oh, you can't get into the store without a mask or a vaccine, or I probably shouldn't say that, a card. Like, seems like they can tell you who can come in and who can't. Seems like not far off. Could it really be easily implemented where you can't pay for something without a mark in your hand or your forehead? So that's why I'm like, if that's in 1,000 years, then what is in, like, what are we doing for 1,000 years in between during, or not 1,000 is probably the wrong number to use because that'll get, but like 1,000,000 years when Jesus comes back, if this is future, seems like it's not far future.
So would you, in your opinion, Jesus could maybe come back in the next few years?
Well, I think it would have to at least 7 years. There's a 7-year, but yeah. I mean, why couldn't it be soon? They thought it was soon. It would have to be sooner for now. If like Paul thought it was soon, it's like, well, I mean,
year it becomes closer, whatever the day is.
2,000 years now. It's like that's got to be sooner.
So we know soon at least means 2,000 years.
Yeah, it at least means that. Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, I want to definitely get back to this idea of the mark of the beast because I have a totally different perspective on that. But I think hopefully you'll find some value in where I'm coming from because anyway, so back to the dispensational definition, those 3 points. I actually totally agree with the third point. The first, which is that God's purpose is for his glory and not the salvation of mankind. And so I think both of us agree that like God's purpose for the world is ultimately his own glory. And so we don't disagree there. I don't think that's really a distinction between dispensationalism and the alternative that I hold, which is called covenant theology. And then, by the way, let me just define covenant theology. I think covenant theology is a lot more broad than dispensationalism. And dispensationalism likes to categorize the Bible in terms of dispensations, of course. And what a dispensation is, and you can tell me if you disagree with this, is a dispensation is basically just a period of time where God acts a certain way in like the most basic form. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to be as fair as possible.
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and so I think dispensation is a covenant, or it can be a covenant. Like a covenant fits into the definition of a dispensation. And even in the list of dispensations, like, I don't know if you're familiar with the traditional like 7 or 8 dispensations. That comes from C.I. Scofield, by the way, those like 8 dispensations. And he was the one who published the Scofield Reference Bible that I've talked about on social media. But he's the one who kind of created those dispensations, and a lot of the dispensations that he uses is actually totally lines up with the covenants, which is
Mhm.
the Adamic covenant, the Mosaic, the Abrahamic, and so on, and then eventually the New Covenant. But so covenant theology uses the covenants to categorize the Bible, and then dispensations, I think, uses the dispensations, which could line up with covenants depending on how you define it. Um, but the other 2 points of the definition of dispensation is where I think both of us would differ, you and I,
Okay.
where uh, literal interpretation. But to clarify, I don't actually have a problem with the term literal interpretation. I think I do interpret the Bible literally, and I definitely want to talk about that.
Yep.
And then the second point I disagree on, which is the distinction between Israel and the church.
Mhm.
And so, just to share my kind of view about literal interpretation, is that the word literally just means accurately or true. And so I think there's not a person in the world, like even the most crazy progressive Christian, thinks that they interpret the Bible accurately, right, or truly. And so I kind of don't like the fact that dispensationalism has kind of hijacked the word literal, because I'm like, I interpret the Bible literally. I interpret the Bible accurately and truly. And so I think what literally in this case actually means is that dispensationalism, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, kind of shies away from the use of metaphor and figures of speech and allegory in and instead tries to interpret as many passages as possible, and especially prophecy, uh, as plainly and at face value as possible. Is that correct?
Yeah, but I would say like you still recognize that there are metaphors.
Good.
Like
Okay.
you, like I think if you're gonna try to argue your point, you would say like when it's like if your eye's causing you to sin, gouge it out. And it's like, do you think that I really think that? And no, but I totally agree with you that everyone thinks that they take it literally. So you even wrote that to me, and I was like, I agree with you. It bothers me when it's said in my group,
Good.
because I'm like, well, everyone thinks they're taking it literally. If literally is just meaning correctly,
Yeah.
well, just take it correctly. It's like, well, what do you think everyone's trying to do? So I think literally, um, maybe there could be a better word, because
Yeah.
who's to decide? Then I think I'm taking it literally, and you're like, well, I'm taking it literally. Well, now what?
Right.
So I agree.
Yeah. And so one of the guys that you shared with me, Lee Brainerd, he had like a way more extreme definition of literally, which I assume you disagree with based on what you just said, which is we ought to take the Bible completely literally whenever at all possible. Um, Forget, like throw out metaphors, figures of speech, whatever, unless it is absolutely impossible. Like if, and the example that he uses, I think, is when Jesus says that he's the Lamb of God. Jesus isn't a lamb, he's not a little animal. And so, therefore, that makes absolutely no sense. And so, that cannot be a metaphor. But in general, it seemed to be from the video that I watched that he wanted to interpret like nothing. I'm trying to be charitable. Uh, have as few metaphors as possible unless it is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, so I really like him.
Sure.
He is he really wants to hammer things hard, and I think that I would have I couldn't imagine he would think a literal lamb like he's not stupid, right? Like,
Sure.
but I agree when he says that I'm kind of like I think he thinks everyone just knows what he means. I agree.
Yeah.
Yep,
Well,
yep.
what he's saying is that Jesus is not a lamb because it is impossible for Jesus to be a lamb. And so he's saying like
Oh,
we
so
should
that would have to be a metaphor.
right. And so he's saying like only use metaphors when it is absolutely necessary. And but the problem that I have with that uh method of interpretation, that definition, is that it is technically possible for Jesus to be a lamb. Like Jesus in some moment could like transform into a lamb and then transform back to a human. Like there are crazier things that happen in the Bible. You know, the Red Sea was parted, Jesus came back to life. And so if we were to just say, well, that doesn't make sense to me, and therefore it must be metaphorical, um, I mean, that's progressivism. And so even though I think he's trying to be very conservative
Yeah,
with
yeah.
his definition of the Bible, and I know he is,
Right.
I think that that definition falls flat because it actually leads to relativism, saying my feeling, my own perception of common sense dictates what the Bible means and not what it actually says. You know what I
Yep,
mean?
I can totally get there with your point, and I get it. So
So
I think that in the end we're just gonna say I'm interpreting it properly, and
right.
no, I am.
And so a different kind of definition that I
Okay.
want to consider instead of his, I think his is way too extreme and it's just wrong.
Okay.
But Ryrie, who I mentioned before, he basically says he's like metaphors are okay, figures of speech are totally okay. Use them where appropriate. However, the main distinction between dispensationalism and non-dispensationalism is not the general use of metaphor, but it is um, specifically prophecy. Do when we are talking about the sun and the stars falling, does that literally mean the sun goes dark and the stars fall out of the sky, or is that symbolic of something? And so I think uh, what I think the more reasonable view for you to hold is not that we should throw out all metaphors like Brainerd tries to do, but that we should um, that you are trying to interpret prophecy at a more like face value reading, um, not using symbolism for prophecy. And I think we should be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But
Okay.
then
I don't
I
want to
think
put words in your mouth.
no, it does, but I think what the people like who are trying to say what I generally agree with is
Mm.
is it easier to get off track trying to take it more literally, or is it easier to get off track saying, no, this really means this and that, and it's all floaty, and I'm just gonna grab this? You're like, well, now I'm making an extreme for you, right? Like, oh, you can just have this thing mean anything because your heart's telling you that, or like what's your guideline for what's appropriate and what's not when you're reading a passage? Like, oh, this kind of sounds right, so like now you're right. Where'd you even come up with that? I guess is what you would say.
Yeah, and but interestingly, I would actually like I said about Brainerd's definition that we talked about. I think what dispensationalists are in danger of doing is that. So by allowing for the Bible to use figurative language, in my view, like for prophecy, let's say, and I think ultimately what we have to do to figure this out is just to look at specific examples. But right now, I'm just talking very
Yep.
generally and definition wise. So eventually, like we'll talk about a couple of specific prophecies and a couple of different views of those and see which one makes sense. But um, to me, to my view, and I'm okay with metaphor and symbolism and figurative language when appropriate. I think someone who is just like, well, the Bible means exactly what it says. To me, they're the ones who are really flaky with what the Bible means, because you like he himself said, like obviously Jesus is not like, he doesn't just transform into a lamb. So we have to be willing to understand that the Bible uses figurative language and metaphor sometimes when appropriate. So the question is just, where are they? Where are the metaphors? Where is the figurative language?
Yeah. Like, when
And
is
so
it appropriate?
right. And so I
Yep.
think that's the common ground that we can both share, that like metaphors, figurative language are totally okay. I think every Christian, even Christians who maybe thoughtlessly say, no, we can't interpret the Bible figuratively. Like you interpret the Bible figuratively in a lot of places. Like you
Mhm.
can't make these blanket claims like that.
Yeah.
Just like I think you can't say like, well, I interpret the Bible literally and you don't, because
Yes. Yeah.
everybody's trying to.
So one thing that if this gets us off topic, you can get us back on. But so like, I'm super interested in like the early church fathers. This is a new thing of mine that I'm like,
Yeah.
kind of just like anything. Where are all these people getting their information from? Well, the source, like how far back? I mean, obviously it's the Bible, but when you're saying what can we take literally and what do we take as a metaphor and all this stuff, the best way to do it is be in that time period.
Right.
Like right now, this is an example I just heard and it just like fits pretty good. It was like, I woke up at 8:15 and I slept like a rock. Okay, so like we would know what that meant. 8:15 is the actual time, and I slept like a rock. You're not really a rock. But maybe somebody else wouldn't be like, what are you talking about? So if we go back to like when this was written and try to get in their heads and understand like, when are you saying a metaphor and when aren't you? Like, you almost like have to know the whole language and all the like the metaphors of that time. And so
Sure.
that's why I'm like thinking the best way to figure this out is like surrounding the Bible during that time. What are they thinking? Don't you think that, right? The further.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And it's also valuable because although church tradition is not inerrant, like church tradition is not infallible,
Mhm.
but it is valuable. And
Yeah.
so if Christians for 2,000 years almost have believed a certain thing, it could be wrong, but it's much more likely that it's not wrong,
Yep.
because there's this tradition that dates back all the way to the Bible. And so the question is that dispensationalism? And so you said you might have some quotes from early church fathers. Do
Well,
you have?
okay. So when I did find one and I'm pretty pumped about it, but
Okay.
you'll probably say it doesn't count. So
Okay.
okay, so when you first asked me, like, oh, some quotes from early church fathers, I'm like, I don't even know which one to pick because I see all these things. And so I thought I really got you because I'm like, oh, this one says don't allegorize. And I totally, like, from what I understood, you were thinking, and like, this guy just allegorizes like crazy. This will really get him because it says don't allegorize. So I'm like, what's he going to say about this? And then you're like, I don't allegorize. And then it gets us back to this literal conversation, right? So I'm like, okay, that doesn't count apparently. So like maybe if I have pick three of them that say dispensation, is that going to count for him? And I do have one question. Okay, so you said that doesn't count because every Christian ever believes in dispensations.
Yeah, well, so let me give some
Oh,
background.
okay.
So one thing so I made a post that claimed that dispensationalism was not taught before 1800, which I
Mhm.
still think is true.
Yeah.
Uh, and then you shared with me a bunch of quotes from early church fathers where they were talking about dispensations. And so my response was, well, yeah, I believe in dispensations. Like
Yeah.
if we just define dispensations as, which is the way that they did in these quotes, um, which is basically God is acting a certain way in this dispensation. A lot of those quotes said basically things like that. Like I agreed with 100% of the quotes that you shared. And so therefore those quotes aren't actually teaching dispensationalism. They're
Mhm.
just teaching that covenants exist essentially,
Yeah. Is what you
which
think. Or
right. So
and
I,
it's
I I don't have an issue with any of those
okay.
quotes.
Yeah. Well, so that was frustrating for me because I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, apparently any quote you come up with isn't going to count. Okay. Right.
It could
So,
be because there's actually no quotes.
well, there is.
Okay. Yeah.
Are we doing this now? Okay.
Yeah.
So then well, this is why I like talking to people who maybe I disagree with or just don't understand. Cause then I'm like, now I've got to figure this out. And it sent me down this huge rabbit hole and I learned a ton of stuff
Mhm.
and more about what I think you understand or you think too. Okay. So now I don't know if you know, you're probably not going to like him if you do this. Andy Woods is a teacher who.
I don't think I've heard.
Okay. So somehow I stumble upon this whole series of his that is called Ever Reforming, and it's about Reformed theology, and he's dispensationalism or whatever. And I'm like, oh, what's this guy talking about? So it's a 14-part series, and I only watched the first two and the last two, so I still got 4 hours in. But it starts out like this. It's saying, and you should watch this maybe, but I don't know. So it starts out with like everything I was hoping like to find about, okay, so there's like this, the first, like right after Acts in Antioch, they start like the school, okay? So it's like the early church fathers, the first 200 years of church. And so what is being taught by Andy Woods in this thing is that that school for the first 200 years, of course, taught dispensationalism, not called that, but yeah. So like that there's a literal 1,000 years, because I think this literal 1,000 years is kind of like key to stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If it's literal or not would be like kind of a big part of it.
Does he? Yeah, I think a lot of people that aren't actually dispensationalists also believe in a literal 1,000 years.
Okay.
I think that is a symbolic number personally,
Okay.
but I'm not here to argue my personal view. I'm just here to argue against dispensationalism. And so
and then I kind of have a question about that too, but we'll get there. Let me just
okay.
quick finish this. It'll take like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, so this Justin Martyr, okay,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
80, 100 through 160. He says now of this like first 200-year chunk that he's in.
Mm-hmm.
But I and every other completely Orthodox Christian feel certain that there will be a resurrection of the flesh, followed by 1,000 years in the rebuilt, embellished, and enlarged city of Jerusalem, as it was announced by the prophets Ezekiel, Isaiah, and others. And I'm like, that sounds pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is that going to count for Cody? Like, what's he going to say?
It sort of counts, but you can continue.
It's closer than my other ones, right?
I definitely have a response.
Okay, let's closer to this. Okay, so just thank you for letting me finish this. So then it's saying, okay, so that was like the first 200 years. Then something went wrong. What went wrong was in Alexandria, Egypt, the school of like the symbolic, like total, which I bet you disagree with too, is everything's allegorized. So then it just like goes crazy and everyone's just making stuff up like crazy. And so that's probably where you're like, yeah, I agree with that. Don't allegorize stuff, because you're thinking of maybe this time period that eventually gets saved by the reformers, like Martin Luther and like Calvin and all these people. And so you're like, yeah, they kind of brought back the covenant stuff, like you're saying, right? And more literal than what had been going on. So then like kind of the summary of what Andy Woods's whole series was about was, but it didn't quite go far enough, and it's still being revealed, because in Daniel 12 it says like throughout time what's already there is just going to get more revealed. And so what he's criticizing, probably your thinking, is you kind of stopped and got stuck at the reformers period, and you're just totally rejecting anything after that, even though Daniel says it's going to continue to be revealed until the time of the end. So like why are we stopping in like, would it be the 15 or 1600s? Like then we're done, then it's not being revealed still till the end. At least does it make sense what I said?
Yeah, I get that. So you have this Justin Martyr quote that is 100% premillennial. So Justin Martyr historically absolutely believes that Jesus will return before the millennial kingdom, right? So that if that's what you're trying to prove, you got me.
Okay.
But is he teaching? So at the very beginning, we defined dispensationalism. Does that quote prove that there is not a distinction between Israel and the church, or that we should take a literal, non-metaphorical interpretation of a biblical prophecy?
No, but don't you think it would like set a tone, like 1,000 years is 1,000 years, so quit saying it's not, and then it would almost like lead you down the path of at least maybe more justifying. Like a
Yes.
thousand years is a thousand years and it hasn't happened yet. It kind of sets your a little bit your tone and also like your timeline to be us, and it hasn't happened yet.
Sure. So there are actually a lot of premillennials through history. And I think a lot of these people, a lot of the quotes that I see, a lot of the things that people have sent me, they are often quotes just mentioning the word dispensation. And by the way, none of these people spoke English. And so we can, dispensation can mean, at least biblically, maybe a better word to use instead of dispensation is like stewarding or management or something like that. And so dispensationalism might not even be the best translation for that word in most cases in the Bible,
Okay.
because it's not actually referring to a time period. It's referring to like stewarding something.
Yep.
But regardless, and so all these early church fathers that even say the word dispensation, we might not even be translating those properly, and they might be saying something else. But regardless, I'm not saying that that proves dispensationalism wrong or anything.
Right.
But there are tons of early church fathers that are premillennial, but they would actually also disagree with your the way that you interpret scripture. And so I disagree with their premillennialism, but I would much rather you be a historic premillennial as opposed to a dispensational premillennial, if that makes sense. And
Well,
so,
I don't know, like all
sure.
these terms, but okay. So,
So
are you
just
going to tell me what to believe?
no,
I'm
just
kidding, but kind of not.
just because they're premillennial, it doesn't mean they're dispensationalists.
Okay.
The thing that I have a problem with is in the teaching of dispensationalism, one, that there's no distinction between Israel and the church, and two, that we need to interpret prophecy, literally, quote
Okay.
unquote. No, I don't like using the word that way, and not figuratively in a lot of ways.
Okay.
Um, and therefore, if that is the teaching of dispensationalism, then it is true that there was not a single person that believed in dispensationalism prior to 1800 when it was first formulated by John Darby. That's my argument.
Okay. I see what you're saying. Um, and then I guess maybe am I even saying that because if I believe throughout time because of Daniel 12, it's going to like slowly be revealed.
Sure.
Am I saying you're just saying it's wrong because Darby did was
Oh,
one? No, okay, let me just say it, and then you can say how I'm saying the wrong thing. So
sure.
like I would say whoever kept like on with this revelation of what was already there. I guess it was in the 18 or 1900s. Okay, so what? Like, why is that horrible? Oh, somebody revealed something that was already there that we were told how that was going to happen later, but now we're mad because it happened later, but it's supposed to happen later. Do you at least get?
I do.
Like,
I see what you're
okay.
saying. One of the biggest arguments I think that a lot of dispensationalists use is when I say something like dispensationalism wasn't taught prior to 1800. Everybody wants to value church tradition, and so we realize if there's something that just has not existed for 2,000 years and all of a sudden it pops up, that's kind of a strong argument against the thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true,
Mm-hmm.
because there were certain aspects of theology that popped up during the Reformation in the 1500s that
Mm-hmm.
may necessarily exist prior to that, and I think they're true.
Mm-hmm.
But it is like a powerful argument against large aspects of theology. Like, for example, we can say, well, Mormonism isn't true because it actually happened to pop up also in the 1800s. And say, like, there's no historical evidence for the truth of Mormonism whatsoever. We can say that Jehovah's Witness isn't true for exactly the same reason. Like, nobody believed that. Like, nobody believed the stuff
Mm-hmm.
that prior to that.
Yep.
Now, we still, with these people, need to go into the specific evidence and explain why they're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So just a lack of people believing that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but I think it's a strong argument against it. And I think it's also a problem because a lot of dispensationalists try to say, like, you've been listening to these guys, they're trying to convince you that, no, look, you see, it has been taught for 2,000 years prior to 1800, but actually that's not true because the quotes they're giving you, uh, I I agree with a lot of them, and not actually dispensationalists. They might be premillennial. There might be like a few stragglers here and there that might believe that Israel is a totally distinct entity from the church, but it's never was it ever historically a big popular view in the Christian church. And so let's talk about these things specifically instead of just generally.
Okay.
One, I'm really interested in your opinion about Israel and the church, because that's one of the key elements that we would probably disagree on.
Mm-hmm.
I shared a bunch of verses, and so I'll just cut to the chase. I don't know if you remember the
Can
verses.
Can I say one thing though before I forget it?
Yeah, please.
Just for like the whole 1800s thing and Jehovah's Witnesses, if it harmonizes the Bible, like if what was said in the 1800s and it's you're going to say it's a new idea, maybe I'm going to say it's like a revelation of the ideas that were already there.
Sure.
As long as it doesn't contradict the Bible, like a Jehovah's Witness, that does. So you can be like, oh, that was invented around the same time. So it's like, well, one of them lines up the Bible and the other one doesn't. So, so I guess I just wanted to say a point, like, to me, it seems like it makes everything clear. It doesn't contradict anything, is what I think. So like, that argument is like, oh, well, it doesn't contradict anything.
So just to let you know, if you hold that position that it's okay that it hasn't been taught for 1800 years, then therefore you can't use that as evidence to prove your view. You know what I mean?
I can see that. And so I probably won't find a quote from the early church fathers that prove it in like, so, okay, but I still think I'm right about my position.
And you're totally right. The ultimate measure of truth is if the view lines up with scripture. So you're totally right about that. Right on.
So your question about this quote was just a complete trick because you knew that it probably, but okay, let's move on. Maybe we can move on. I think I get it.
I wouldn't call it a trick. I was asking you if there are any church fathers who actually.
It was a trick based on your high standards of this quote. But okay.
Okay. Whatever. So the is Israel well, let's see, how do I word this? Is Israel and the church biblically distinct, or are they both true Jews and true Christians, part of the body of Christ? How do you parse that out?
So for some reason, like I really like thinking about this, and it doesn't seem that confusing to me. So, and I knew that this was going to come up. So it's Romans 11. I don't know if you read that whole thing really carefully, and I have several times because I'm like, this is the one that I'm like, if you read this literally in the right way, how I do, it's like, this makes so much, like, how is this even confusing? So right now I do believe that believing Jews, believing Gentiles, that because this dispensation is everyone's in if you believe, right? So Jew or Gentile, all that right now. But the only reason that I don't want to get into the rapture or the tribulation, but I believe the tribulation 7-year time is like you're in the car and you're driving and some people miss the exit and you don't care if they miss the exit unless you made a promise to them a long time ago that they wouldn't miss the exit. So now you got to circle back around and you're going to like redo your route and be like, okay, this is like, now I'm going to make it really obvious that this is the exit. The exit is Jesus. I hope that makes sense to you. So I kind of feel like the 7-year tribulation has to fit into this because like Jesus is, or like it's a U-turn to like pick up everyone that just couldn't figure it out yet. Does that make sense? At least what I'm trying to say, whether you agree with it or not.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
So you're saying the purpose of I'm following, but I'm not sure it makes sense.
I think that God made a promise to the descendants of Abraham.
Mm-hmm. And what is an example of some of the promises that you think have yet to be fulfilled with Israel?
So
I don't mean to put you on the spot. So if you don't know any off the top of your head, that's a-okay.
Well, I guess I envision like Jesus is going to rule from there. This is the land. I still think that. And
Yeah.
I think that he made like, I'll be your God and you'll be my people. And this is this land and the like bloodline descendants, like this, like I will make sure like you guys are set apart. So I guess I feel like if they're not set apart, they are set apart, or are they not set apart? And so like people in my view, I hear them say this is, oh, you're making Jesus a liar or God a liar if he's not going to fulfill like these promises, like what he said he was going to do. But you would probably say like he already did that. Would you say that?
Yeah, I would say that he has and he is actively the God of his people, which is Jews and Gentiles, which it kind of sounds like you would agree with.
Yeah, but okay, so I wish I had Romans 11, and it's probably not going to really help because I'm sure you've read it before.
Yeah,
but it's I feel like that just summarize, like, just read Romans 11, Cody.
Yeah. So my understanding of Romans 11 is, so there's the tree, and then different branches are grafted into the tree, and some are removed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that's the passage you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Okay.
Okay, and so the tree is Jesus. You know, all of the people of God are grafted in somehow to the tree, and at some point, certain branches are cut off of the tree. That's what Romans 11 says, and then other times new branches are grafted on, and the Gentiles is one of the branches that was grafted on. But what's interesting is if you actually read Romans 11, one thing that Paul says is he's warning the Gentiles from being cut off from the branch. And I think he specifically says like the Jews were. And so the idea is the Jews at that time were cut off from, and I don't know if this necessarily is a problem in your view, but the Jewish people currently, they're unfaithful. I think both of us would agree on that.
Yeah. Yep.
By and large, the Jewish people are unfaithful. They are cut off from the branch of God's people, even though the believing Jews are still very much a part of God's people and always will be, because all believers have always been a part of God's people. Mm-hmm. Because God's people is based on faith and not on blood. Mm-hmm. But eventually, the idea is, and in my view, in postmillennialism, I think especially, is the idea that eventually the whole world will come to be grafted into this branch, and that the Jews will, in fact, return to faith. So that's what I believe. And I know that you actually believe that too, that the Jews will become faithful again at some point in the future. And so we actually believe the same thing there. But I think we both think that it'll come about in different ways.
Yeah, like the method of how we get there is okay. Well, yeah, I don't know. For some reason, like all I'm going to say is read Romans 11, and I know that that's not really a good answer. But when I read it, I'm just like, I don't know. I just feel like it explains everything better than I could. It's just like, just read it. But obviously, we have different. Like we must be seeing something different in there.
So let's move on.
Yeah.
Something I think that we will probably disagree about in a more of a clear way. Unless you have any more questions up until that point.
No, I don't, but I have like 6 more minutes just so let's like hit really good stuff.
Okay. When Jesus says, I don't know if off the top of your head you are familiar with Matthew 24. A lot of dispensationalists believe he's talking about the end times. When he says after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light, and so on. And then he says in verse 34, truly I say to you, and this might be, we might need to continue this conversation another day or something. But he says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Mm-hmm. What does Jesus mean when he says this generation? And the way I take it is actually literally that the people Jesus is talking to is the generation that he's referring to. This generation that he's talking to will not pass away until all these things that Jesus said takes place. Yep. So what does that mean to you?
Right. So I think you obviously know what I'm going to say is why you're asking this. So
you believe that's a metaphor?
Yeah, duh. So this is like, an area I specifically have not done a deep dive in. And so when I'm going to answer this, it's more based on the people that I trust in the areas that I have dug deep. This is what they would say. So I don't feel like I get like that is a whole. To me, it feels shaky ground, right? But
Yeah.
what they would say, and I'm like, I don't know, I agree with like almost everything else. So I don't know, maybe that one. It almost would have to be. So if the fig tree generation, right? So they're saying that Israel's a fig tree, that's the symbol. Is that used in other places? It seems like it is because everyone talks like it is. Have I specifically looked? No, but I kind of want to. I just have never done it. So they're talking about that generation when the fig tree blossoms.
Sure.
Is a metaphor, obviously, for Israel coming back in the land in 1948. Okay, that generation, the 1948 generation of Israel, the fig tree blooming, won't pass away. So then in like my circle, everyone's like, oh, what's a generation? But they're saying the generation of Israel coming back into the land. Somehow the fig tree means that. And we are nearing the end of that generation, which is another reason why people who believe what I do would say we're nearing the end, because this generation can't live much longer.
Yeah. So one, I wanted you to admit that you're interpreting a prophecy metaphorically,
Yep.
which is okay. But as long as you know that, so therefore you don't interpret prophecies literally like Darby or Brainerd or any of these other guys say. So you're actually not on board with them, which is awesome with me because you're like, we're in the same boat.
No, but I don't like that. Like, I'm gonna say this one. I'm like, I know what I'm saying, but I'm like, that doesn't really line up that well.
Okay.
Well, right.
So, okay. Good. The other question is, so when Jesus, and I don't want to push too hard on this, but it seems to me that if Jesus is speaking to a group of people and says, and is talking to them and says, this generation will not pass away. And he's been talking to them the whole rest of this dialogue. And he's saying this generation won't pass away until these things happen. But Jesus is not actually talking about them. Why is he not lying to them?
Well, I think that
they would have thought that he was talking about them.
Well, not if he said, what did he say like directly before it? I don't know offhand, but I feel like
he was
using the context here, because just because he was talking to people automatic. Well, what did he say in between there?
Yeah. So right before that, he's talking about this judgment language about the sun going dark, the stars falling. And so you're saying that they would have thought, well, the sun didn't fall. And so therefore Jesus wasn't talking to us. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying and I have not studied this that deeply, but I'm saying if he is talking about this fig tree generation, and if it was like super obvious to them that he was talking about the fig tree and they knew what that meant, then I think it works. But I've heard people say like, what's a big hole in your interpretation? Everyone probably has some. I feel like the only reason I trust that one is because everything else around the theory of Israel coming back in 1948, there's so much that lines up with all that I'm like, I guess I'll give that, I'll kind of let that slide. I guess it can be justified. I don't think it's the strongest, but because of everything else, I'll throw that in the category.
That's good.
Wouldn't you do that too of stuff?
Maybe
not that one. I don't know, but like just of stuff, you're like, well, the context clues of everything surrounding this theory being right, and you kind of can make it work.
Maybe I'd have to think about it. I would need to be confronted with something like that. But my goal is
like yours is so
no, I'm
it.
Both of us think that our view is solid, but I'm saying I would need to be confronted with a view of mine that maybe doesn't make sense, and then I would want to make as much sense as possible. And so I think, the ideal position doesn't have any of those kinds of problems.
Yeah.
But just to tell you my view, to give you the other view, and then I'll let you have the last word, and then we'll close.
Okay.
Is a lot of the prophecies that I think refer to the judgment and the great tribulation is I think were fulfilled with the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And that view would make Jesus's language totally make sense in that passage. I think Jesus was not being literal when he says the sun will go dark, the stars will fall out of the sky, all this evil, terrible stuff is going to happen to you before you pass away. And it really did happen in AD 70 during the time that that generation was still alive. And I can, I'm confident that that is metaphorical language, that judgment language, because so like I'm taking the judgment language to be metaphorical, and you're taking the this generation to be metaphorical. And so like, one of us has to have something metaphorical in there. So it's not like I'm the one taking the whole thing metaphorical. We both are kind of doing this in one of these places. But the other place in the Bible that we see the same kind of language being used is Isaiah 13:10, where Jesus actually quotes from. And it says the stars in the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will go dark. The stars will fall, that kind of thing. And in Isaiah, and you can look this up. And like I said, we can continue this conversation later, probably, because I like this a lot. But the same language that's used in Isaiah is referring to this judgment that was going to happen to Babylon, which did happen, but the stars never fell out of the sky. And so that language is used in the Bible whenever like bad stuff is going to happen. The bad stuff happened to Jerusalem in AD 70. And so therefore, I think a lot of this stuff that dispensationalists apply to the future, inappropriately, I think, already happened. That doesn't mean that everything in the Bible happened in the past. There's still going to be a resurrection. There's still going to be, hope for the future and all that. But I think that that particular thing is an example of something that dispensationalists, one, take metaphorically, and two, it is actually a prophecy that already happened, which kind of is a big verse that defines this premillennial, pre-trib premillennial view. So that's it. You can have your last one.
And then mine is it's just like, this is another conversation, but my biggest argument for just like this whole pattern of let's say timeline pattern, like that's I'm like, what is happening right now then, and why does it fit so well? Like, and you would say, oh, because you're making it fit. Maybe
I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I would love, we're not going to have time for it, but I would absolutely love to talk about some of the end time prophecies that you think are being fulfilled now, like the mark of the beast stuff.
I don't think they're being fulfilled now, but it seems like it's like being set up for it. But yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, like to me, I'm just like, what do you think's happening right now then?
Yeah. So maybe if you're okay with it, you can come back for another episode.
Yes, but I get so nervous for these. I don't know if I can have another day. Yeah, for sure I will. But then my other main thing I want to say is this, and I think you agree that this isn't a salvation issue. Do you agree with that? Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because here's what I don't get. We're both studying the Bible. Like, how many people are doing that? Hardly anyone. We both are studying it so deeply that we have strong enough opinions to talk for an hour here about stuff. Like, good. We're not enemies, and like all the people who are like are fighting, it's like, you guys, we're such a minority of people in the world who are studying the Bible, but we act like there's just like this huge war going on between us. And it's like, are you kidding me? Like, I found somebody who's studying the Bible and who wants to talk about this. What a miracle, right? So I don't know. I'm just glad that you want to talk about this stuff, because I can't really find a lot of people who would even know what I was talking about.
Yeah. And that's great. Absolutely. That's a wonderful place to close on, because like I said at the beginning, there are a lot of people who are nasty about this topic. There's a lot of dispensationalists where the claws come out. And I know there's a lot of anti-dispensationalists who are just unwilling to have a conversation and try to find some common ground. So I really appreciate you coming on and being able to share your opinions and be willing to receive pushback and to push back on me. And hopefully this was educational for people on both sides of the fence who are going to listen to this episode. So thanks so much for coming on.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for having me on.